So now that we have covered the basics of using keyframes for scale changes and also using connectors to create relative movement, we're going to move on and look at a more complex animation like this, which really, it's only complex because it has so many little sub-animations. But every cluster of flowers that's animating out here these are all clones of each other. In fact, every segment of the beanstalk is a clone of the one below it. So each segment is a curve in the stem, 2 leaves, 1 tendril, and then in most of the segments, there's one of these bean flower clusters. I skipped the bottom. I did 2 on the next one just to make it a little bit uneven and not look quite so manufactured. And then at the very top, there's 1 more tendril that just comes out the top. But all the tendrils are just clones. All the bean clusters are clones. Each one has its own little timeline. And so I'm going to show the method that I used for combining all those into one, and also mention that this nice flower pot here is not something I made. That was made by Ed, and he was nice enough to make that available to the community, and I need a flower pot for my magic beanstalk, so it worked out very well. So I'm going to move back now. I went briefly over the elements that are in this beanstalk. There's the growing tendril, the leaf, which is not in itself animated. All it does is change in scale and position. The leaf itself doesn't have any internal animations. And the animated bean cluster, which is the most complex of these sort of sub-elements. And so what I did was to start creating a beanstalk, and I did that initially just by making this first segment. And if I scope in here, this is just one piece. It's actually very similar to the tendril piece. Really the only difference is that it doesn't taper from one end to the other the way that the segment in the tendril does, but it's just the curve tool that's been very carefully placed out. I did actually use the grid to get it started because I wanted it to sort of have a starting and end point that were relatively just in vertical alignment to each other, and then I just tweaked it a little bit from there. So as you can see, each segment here has its own little timeline on it. And if I open up that timeline, there are a few keyframes on it. I'm going to turn on X-ray here so that we can make sure that we see there are other timelines here that are getting hidden from the object groupings. So each of these segments, I'm going to actually move up to the next one that has the bean cluster on it here. So that's a timeline that is for that bean cluster and the other things that happen on this segment. The leaves are all just very simply keyframed. Let me make sure that we can see our connectors here. I am using connectors on the leaves so they don't sort of float away from the stem. Oops. Oops. So if I open up this timeline here, this is just for those leaves and the vine. As I move through, you can see them. They just get larger and bend. And then the vine is actually just the timeline that was in the, the tendril. The tendril had its own couple of keyframes on a timeline. I just moved those onto one timeline with the leaves just to sort of keep everything organized. So the first thing I did was to, in creating the final beanstalk, I made this shape that's a segment and I copied it out to sort of get an idea of whether it was going to work as a shape. Then I worked on one segment at a time. So I actually started with the base segment for my sort of layout and sculpting. And if I get rid of that timeline here, you can see this is how I put it together with the leaves all the way out, the tendril all the way out. And then I set up those animations on the timeline. Oops. I think I messed something up there. Yeah. I did something there that I didn't mean to that messed up that timeline, so I'm just going to exit out without saving. And this is why it's always good to save backups, because sometimes you do something without meaning to. And now, if I play this back, you can see everything is kind of growing at the same rate. There's no height in the actual beanstalk itself. It's just all of its little individual parts coming out. I did this as a first stage because I wanted to make sure that my finished beanstalk really looked the way that I wanted it to. I'm considering making another scene later on where this is actually used as part of a platformer, and so I want it to be a really solid component that works on its own as the finished product. And that's why I like this starting at the endpoint method of animating, where you look at your finished shape and then you kind of break it down from there. So once I had this much of it done, which again is just taking this one part that I made and sort of cloning it out and changing the scale to have the finished product, I then did a remix because I think that's a good point to sort of save a backup copy in case I wanted to do something different or if I did something accidental, because at this point, I got to this stage about maybe 8 hours before the deadline on the community jam, and I was really keen to make sure that I got this part working the way that I wanted it to, which eventually I did. So now here is the whole beanstalk. And what's changed between the other version and this, the previous version that I remixed this from, is just that I have shrunken down the individual segments of the beanstalk one at a time to get it really nice and small. So I'm going to just go through the timeline here and take it to the end. I brought it in like this as sort of in its finished state. And then I started shrinking down these individual parts. And just like I showed on the tendril, everything had to be, everything needed connectors to make sure that they didn't sort of slide around and get really strange looking in the whole process. So this is all one group. And so now I can change the scale. Oops. I can change the scale of that whole segment and move it around as a group, including rotating it. And that's how I did the rest of this animation, which was just to take these parts one at a time and scale them down and rotate them until I had everything down really small. Of course, the beans weren't out yet because I had those timelines reset to the beginning. And this, I think, is a good time to go over a troubleshooting aspect, which is that normally if you just take a whole object, and by object I mean maybe a group of sculptures or whatever else you have in there, if you shrink something down so small that it can't be rendered, the action won't actually, it won't be executed. The game will stop you from shrinking it too small. When you have a keyframe active and you're recording, you can actually have things get deleted. So if you take out a keyframe and you record it, and then you take this and you make it super, super tiny, because it has smaller components in it that are even tinier than what you're seeing there, it can get so small that pieces get deleted. And that's not always apparent until it gets played back. And this is something that has been mentioned, and of course, early access, they're still working out bugs and all that. So it's important when you're doing this kind of thing with a lot of scale changes and keyframes to just make sure that you make backup copies and occasionally play back your keyframes and make sure that nothing has gotten deleted or that something hasn't gotten disconnected, because I've also had that happen, which is really down to user error, where you might accidentally delete one of these connectors, and then when you're rescaling something, maybe this leaf up here gets left up at the top because you deleted the connector. So when making animations, do a lot of test playbacks, and also when you have it at a point that's sort of a good stopping point or saving point, stop and do a remix And then you always have that other to go back to, because if I had really messed something up here, then I could have gone back to this version, which really, it was only a couple hours away from completion here. And it was, it's always nice to have something to go back to. That's about it for the sculptural animation tutorial. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to stop by dreamsverse.com. It's also a great place to meet other creators and get general support for your own creations. And you can also find me on Twitter, LBPookachu. Feel free to leave comments here in the YouTube comments section, although I don't check those every day. And if you want to get a hold of me quicker, please use the forum or contact me on Twitter. And thanks for watching.